Hey guys, it's Amber. Today I'm doing a watercolor showdown between the Altenew Artist Watercolor Pans, the Woodless Watercolor Pencils, and the Watercolor Brush Markers. I'm going to be creating 3 cards, one with each of the 3 mediums, and I'll share watercolor tips and tricks with each of those 3 mediums because they may differ. I know there are a lot of crafters who are nervous to start watercolor, so the goal of this is to help you find a medium that suits you best. Be sure to subscribe and watch all the way to the end where I share my thoughts on each medium. The lovely Aram Tasneem has provided our inspiration photo and color palette this month, and her inspiration came from her pajama pants. I love these vibrant colors, and the first thing that I did was figure out what my color palette was going to be. I started by going through my oval ink swatches. So those cards that you see there with the ink swatches on them, those come with your oval inks. And so I picked out Deep Blue Seas, Red Cosmos, and Lapis Lazuli. I thought that these matched the inspiration photo pretty well. And I would also be able to find these colors in each one of these 3 mediums. So here's a close-up of those. So for the Deep Blue Seas, I'm going to be using Sea Breeze and Turquoise. For the Red Cosmos color family, I'll use Ruby Red. I'm just getting that to focus. Sorry you can't see the frosty pink too well there. It's a super light pink. And then for Lapis Lazuli, I'll be using Ultramarine. For the most part, I was able to find all of these colors in each of the mediums. With the exception of the pans, I don't think I picked quite the right color, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So here I have the Artist 24 color pan set here. It's one of my faves. You guys know I use it all the time. I have the brand new Woodless Watercolor Pencils here. And then I also have all 4 sets of the Watercolor Brush Markers. We have Spring Garden, Tropical Fiesta, Winter Wonderland, and Autumn Festival. So you can see I have my swatches in there, and I usually do just keep them in the package, otherwise I will lose them. I'll take those out so you can see the packaging a little bit better. And I want to share the specific colors I chose from each medium. So I have the Ultramarine pencil and the Ultramarine brush marker, the Lapis Lazuli watercolor pan. So that's all from the Lapis Lazuli family. For the Deep Blue Sea, I have Turquoise and Sea Breeze, which goes with that color family. For the watercolor pencil, I also have Turquoise. But for the pan, I couldn't find Deep Blue Seas in the Artist 24 pan set. What I found when I did some swatching is that the Cool Summer Night was pretty close, so I chose that one. And then for Red Cosmos, I have Ruby Red in the brush marker, in the watercolor pencil, and then I have Red Cosmos for the Artist 24 pan set. Okay, for the image, I'm going to use Paint a Flower Poppy. I wanted to use one complete image that was already arranged for me. I felt like that would be easier than having to do masking. This is already going to be a pretty big project since I'm going to paint this 3 times. I've cut some watercolor paper down to 4 1/4 by 3 inches. I just wanted a small little piece, again, just to try and minimize the amount of effort that was going to go into this watercolor showdown. So I'll go ahead and take out the Paint a Flower Poppy stamp. I will use all 3 sentiments that I use on the cards are all from this set as well. And initially I was thinking I would do no line watercoloring, but you couldn't really see the light gray ink that I use. You can barely see it on the watercolor paper there. So I decided to switch over to Obsidian pigment ink. Now, because this is watercolor paper and it's textured, you may need to stamp more than once to get a good clean image. So don't be surprised if you need to stamp multiple times. That being said, having a MISTI or a stamp positioner like this is a great tool exactly for that reason. So I went ahead and stamped all 3 pieces of watercolor paper with my stamp in the MISTI, and it's positioned exactly the same for each card. So first up, we'll start with the watercolor pans. I feel like the watercolor pans are the most common used watercolor, so I thought that was a good place to start. I have a pipette full of clean, clear water, and I'm just going to add a drop of that into each one of the pans. That's going to help rehydrate your pans. So if you re-wet the pans like that, then you're going to save your brushes a little bit of wear and tear. If you're really having to scrub at the pan because there isn't water on it and only your brush is wet, you can start to wear down your brushes a little bit. So that's a good way to get the paint rehydrated quickly and save your brushes a little bit of wear and tear. Here I'm looking at the Cool Summer Nights and I'm not super happy with how dark blue it is. I kind of wanted more turquoise in that. So what I'm going to do is grab Seashore and we'll add a little bit of that, which is good because I do like to have more than just one color. I tend to like to mix colors on the page. So I'll add a little bit of Seashore to this just to add a little bit more of that blue-green, which goes better with our inspiration photo. And I'll be sure to add that color with our other mediums as well. And then I'll go ahead and put some lapis lazuli. Now when I do the other mediums, I'll make sure that the colors are in the same place on this palette as well. This palette here is actually just the lid of a 5x7 palette with 21 small little wells in it. Most of the time I mix my colors directly on my glass mat, but I wanted you guys to be able to see the colors better, so I thought doing it on this lid would be better. Okay, so my favorite way to watercolor is the wet on wet technique. So I have a brush. This is an 8 round brush. It's a pointed round brush. And I've wet it with water. So I have clean, clear water on my brush. And I'm just adding a very thin layer to this one petal. Then I'm going to pick up my pigment. This is the ruby red. And I'll just drop that into the base of the petal. So whenever I am coloring flowers, which is, if you guys follow me, you know that's really what I color. I don't really color anything else other than flowers. But my Copic coloring, my watercoloring, everything is the same formula. I always have it darkest at the base, and anywhere where the petals overlap, there's going to be a casted shadow there. So the petal that I'm doing right now, I feel like that left edge right there that I'm shadowing is a little bit underneath the petal to the left of it. So I'm adding a casted shadow there. Now I've wet my brush. I've cleaned off the pigment from my brush. I've wet it, and I'm bringing in clean, clear water from the tip of the petal down to the pigment that's already on the page, and that's going to help to spread that color out and get that color flowing. Whenever you do that, you want to make sure, if you want to have a highlight at the tip of your petal, you want to make sure that you clean the extra pigment off of your brush. Like you saw, I just dabbed it on my microfiber cloth over there. Clean your brush first before you bring in that clean, clear water. So I'm going to speed up the rest of these petals, and the other place that I always have shadow is underneath the fold of a petal. So here you can see the underneath of those two petals. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and dark underneath the fold of that petal so that there's a casted shadow there. Now I have to wait for those other petals to dry, so I'm going to move on to my stem and my leaves for now. So I have the blue-green mixture that I have here, which is, again, the Cool Summer Night and the Seashore mixed together. I'm making sure that I add darker pigment where the leaf meets the stem and then where the flower meets the stem, just, again, to cast a shadow there and have a little variance in the color. As we go through these exercises, you guys, of me painting each one of these with a different medium, I'll talk about different tips and the variances that I see from one medium to the other and what might make you choose one over the other depending on your style. So I'm just wetting the leaves like I did with my petals, and I'll do that wet on wet technique and bring in the blue-green color. As I was painting these, I really only painted all of the flowers with ruby red. I didn't add any additional colors to those. And now that I'm looking at these, you guys, I never painted the center of these flowers. It didn't even occur to me. I guess I just forgot about it. But in any case, normally when I paint leaves or flowers, each one of them will have more than one color in them. For these flowers, I just kept it simple with the one color. For the leaves, I'm going to use the blue-green that I've mixed and also the lapis lazuli. I'll use the lapis lazuli for the shadows, just so that there's a little bit of a difference in the color. And I think the blue is really pretty for your shadows. So my leaves are wet. I'm dropping in the blue-green shade, and then I'll clean my brush and come in with the clean, clear water and just spread that out a little bit. Now, One of the things about bringing in the clean clear water is you want to make sure that you blot off any paint that you pick up on your brush. Blot that off on your microfiber or your paper towel, whatever it is that you're using. Because if you don't, then you'll just end up spreading that paint all the way to the tip of the leaf or the petal that you're coloring. If you do that, you could obliterate your highlight. If you want to keep your highlight, you need to make sure you clean off your brush so that you don't drag that color all the way to the tip. And you'll see me do that throughout this video. Since you've seen a couple petals and a couple leaves, I'll go ahead and speed up this footage. I did leave all of the painting in this video since the whole point of this video is to give you this watercolor showdown of the different mediums. But I did speed it up after you've seen a couple of the petals and leaves from each one of the mediums. If you're wanting this video to go even faster, you can change your viewing speed with the YouTube settings. So I just wanted to give you an idea of where we are now. So here's a close-up. I love how vibrant these colors are looking right now. What'll be interesting is when we compare this to the watercolor brush markers, these colors, even though they look really vibrant right now, start to look a lot more muted compared to the brush markers. It's pretty striking. So that's one difference that may push you towards the brush markers compared to the pans. So of course, none of my cards are complete without splatter. Normally I go for black splatter, but I wanted to use the mediums that we're working with. So here I'm using the lapis lazuli pan paint here and just splattering that on. Now, if you're having a hard time splattering, wet your brush, get it really wet, and then pick up your pigment and try splattering again. You should get some good splatters that way. If you want larger splatters, you need to use a larger brush. So instead of an 8, maybe use a 12. Here's the finished card, and I'll show you how I finished this card with the washi tape and the matting at the end of the video, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sneak peek here, and then we'll go over this again at the end. For the next card, we're moving on to the watercolor brush marker. So I've got my ruby red, ultramarine, sea breeze, and turquoise. I have the same stamped image, and I'm going to pop these onto my palette here in the same orientation so that you know which colors are which. I'll speed that up. On the bottom, I have sea breeze and then turquoise on the right. Okay, so I've wet the same brush. This is the same number 8 round brush. And I'm going to start with the same petal. So I was trying to decide if I wanted to pick up the pigment directly from the palette, like I have it squeezed out over there, or if I wanted to use the actual marker brush. I opted for the brush marker, but because I had squeezed out all of that paint on my palette, the bristles were so saturated with pigment. You can see I have just a huge blob of ink here. And it's super vibrant, you guys. That's one of the things that I absolutely love about liquid watercolors and these watercolor brush markers is that if you like vibrant colors, this is a medium for you because these are like ridiculously bright and vibrant. They're pretty awesome. So you can use them directly from the brush and get 100% full pigment, or you can put it on a palette and water it down if you want a lighter color. Now here I could see that I had a big drop that was about to drop onto my page there. So I just wiped it off on the palette and then I added a touch more shadow at the base. So I'll do a couple more petals and kind of chat about this medium. So if you are someone who's heavy-handed with your coloring, this might be a medium that's a little harder for you to control the amount of pigment that goes down. And that's actually whether or not you're using the brush marker itself or if you're picking it up from the pan. Even when you pick this up from the pan, if you haven't watered that mixture down, it is crazy, crazy vibrant. Like you could see that right there. I picked that up from not the pan, but from the palette, and it's still super vibrant. So if you're someone who's heavy-handed, or maybe you don't want to be too cautious with your colors, then maybe this isn't the best medium for you. Maybe what would suit you better would be the watercolor pencils, which we'll get to next. So I'm using clean clear water again. You can see I still had a little bit of that pigment in my brush. Now here I'm making a mistake. That petal to the left of it is wet, and you can see that as soon as I put this pigment down, it started to bleed into the petal to the left. You really need to make sure that you let the adjacent petal dry before you paint the one next to it so that you don't get this bleeding. That's how you're going to avoid that. But you know what? I'm already here, so I'm just going to keep going with it. You'll see that it'll bleed in there a couple times. Look, I'm even trying to add shadow here. I mean, it's not a very it's not a very good method, you guys. It's not good decision making skills here, but it does give me a good opportunity to show you how to clean that up. So you want to wet your brush, get all of that pigment off of it, and just kind of clean up that area. You can scrub back and forth a little bit and get it a little bit lighter with just clean, clear water. And that worked out just fine. It's okay that it's a little bit darker there. So that looks really good. So we'll let the rest of those petals dry before we go back to that. So I wanted to make sure that I added some of that blue-green here. Now, I don't know if you guys realize this, but there's the 4 sets of the watercolor brush markers. In the spring garden, there's an emerald. And then also in the, I believe in the winter set, there's an emerald. But they're 2 different shades of the same color. One is a little bit more blue where the other one's a little more green. And so they're just a little bit different. So if you're wondering why you ended up getting 2 of the same color, they're slightly different. They're not the same. So here I'm just showing you that you can mix your watercolor brush marker colors also. You don't have to use it straight out of the brush marker, or you can use it straight out of the brush marker and actually mix the colors on the page if you're doing a wet on wet technique. That's a little bit harder if you're doing wet on dry, but it will mix together if you do the wet on wet technique. So I'll add the blue-green to the stem and then just darken that up with a little bit of the emerald and a little bit of that ultramarine at the base of the flower and where the leaves meet the stem. For the leaves, I'll come in with the blue-green color first, and I'll concentrate that in the middle. And here I actually didn't do, I'm pretty sure I didn't do wet on wet there, you guys. I think I just forgot to wet it first. And so I'll clean my brush and come in and just blend that out a little bit. So right now it's wet on dry. Now, when you do wet on dry, especially with a medium that's as pigmented as this, sometimes it can be a little harder to get your colors moving and get them to blend. These seem to be just really liquefying and kind of melting and moving really easily. But if you're having trouble moving your watercolors, consider whether or not you're doing the wet on wet technique or wet on dry. It is much easier to move the colors when it's wet on wet. So here you can see, since the leaves are already wet with the blue-green color, when I drop in the ultramarine, it just kind of spreads out on its own without much effort from me. I'll speed up the rest of this flower and put on a little bit of music. Okay, for your splatters, you can either flick it directly from the watercolor brush marker, in which case you're going to have very, very fine splatters. I like to have a variance in the size of the splatter, so here I'm using a number 8 round brush. If I wanted larger splatters, then I would use a 10 or a 12 round brush. Here is the comparison. So on the left, we have the watercolor pans. On the right, we have the watercolor brush markers. Look at the difference in the vibrancy. I was really surprised to see that because I consider the watercolor pans to also be super bright. So even on the finished card where the paint is completely dry, you can see that the colors are still very vibrant and they haven't really dried back like you see with some watercolors. Moving on to the Woodless Watercolor Pencils, I'm just going to swatch these out because I've only used these one other time. I used them for the Paint a Flower Sunflower for the release of that stamp set and the Woodless pencils. So I just need to swatch them out, I think, one more time just to get an idea of which color is which and kind of what they look like. This also gives you a good opportunity to see how they melt. So when you're using woodless watercolor pencils or any kind of watercolor pencil, you don't want to use a lot of pressure when you're coloring. You just put on a light amount of color. These are also super vibrant. You're going to get a lot of pigment out of these. A little goes a long way. So just color really lightly. If you color with a lot of pressure, then you may not be able to melt all of those pencil strokes away, and you might not get a smooth finish. So you just want to color lightly like you see me doing here. So here, to the 3 colors that we originally picked, I also added Mountain Mist to get that seashore color family in there. So I'm just going to start off, and it does look like I'm using a lot of pressure when I'm coloring. I'm really not. I'm just using super, super light pressure and really, really small circular motions for the most part. Rather than just using a straight line, I tend to go in very, very small kind of micro circles. So same thing, this is the same petal that we've started with each time. I put color at the base, and on the left side of that petal, where the petal next to it would be casting the shadow, I'm just going to go ahead and melt that down. So I'm going to melt the color down, and then I'm going to wipe off my brush because it's picking up a lot of pigment on my brush. I'm going to get some clean clear water on it and bring the clean clear water to the pigment that's already on the page. So you can see I'm starting up at the tip and then bringing the clean water down to that pigment so that then that pigment can run out into the water that's on the page. That's going to help you preserve your highlight. If you were to go the other direction, you'd probably end up losing a lot of your highlight. So that's my preference in how I like to watercolor, I guess, not just with the Woodless watercolor pencils, but with any of the colors. I should mention I'm coloring on dry paper. So now my paper is wet, but I need to deepen the shadow. So I'm going to take my brush directly to the watercolor pencil, pick up the pigment, and take that to the page. If I were to draw with the pencil on this wet paper, it's going to be a lot harder to move that pigment. And I also run the risk, at least in my experience and what I found, is that it's harder for me to get the pencil strokes out. It doesn't really melt down as well. It puts down so much pigment when you color on wet paper that it's just harder to manage. So if I need to deepen color on paper that's already wet, I'll take my brush to the pencil, pick up the pigment, and then take the pigment to the paper on my brush. Hopefully that makes sense. So for the stems and leaves, what we did with the other 2 mediums, the pans and the watercolor brush markers, is we mixed our 2 colors on the palette. That's not really very easy to do with your color pencils. You're actually just going to mix your colors right on the page. I find it easier to just go ahead and color both of the colors on the page and then wet it and let those mix. If you're uncomfortable with that and you're not sure how much of each color to add, then go ahead and add 1 color first. And then to bring in your second color, just pick up the color with your brush straight from the pencil like we just talked about. I find that there is a lot more control with the pencils. So if you're someone who is new to coloring, new to watercolor, and you're a little bit timid with kind of putting down, maybe nervous about putting down too much color, then color pencils might be a good option for you. It's a good starter place to kind of get comfortable with watercolor if you've never done it before. And these pencils are super pigmented, so you're not losing anything in the vibrancy of your color or the pigmentation of your color. All of that is going to be very similar. In fact, this finished project looks more like the watercolor brush markers than even the pans do. So if you are someone who needs more control, maybe you're not comfortable with loose watercolor or those types of things, consider the pencils. They might be a good option for you. We have to talk about splatter with the watercolor pencils because it's my favorite. I used to use the ink sprays for splatter. Now I just wet my paintbrush, run across the woodless pencil, and just flick it on. You can flick it off of the pencil onto the page. I also recommend using like a number 10 or 12 brush with this technique too, because you'll get larger splatters and it holds more water. So it's easier to get that pigment moving and flicking it off of the brush. If you're not getting a splatter exactly where you want it, then just go ahead and put a dot with your paintbrush right where you want it. Because otherwise what I run into is sometimes I'll want to splatter in one particular spot and I'll just keep splattering and then I'll have over splattered. Look how vibrant this is, you guys. I'm loving that ultramarine pencil. I think it's such a pretty blue, and you can just see that this is so vibrant as well. So here we have all three versions next to each other. I wanted you to be able to see these all side by side. I'll show you this in the final photos as well. But this really gives you a good example. These are in the order that we painted them. So pans on the left, watercolor brush markers in the middle, pencils on the right. So now the one on the left with the pans, I think it's a little bit darker in the leaves and not as bright because I used Cool Summer Nights. If you remember, that color was a little bit different than the colors that we used in the other two. Because you can see that the lapis lazuli splatter and the flower petals from the pans is equally as vivid. So that might be accounting for that little bit of a muddy look in those leaves. So I used Delicate Stripes washi tape. Hopefully this is already released and not a sneak peek, fingers crossed. And I just ran that across the corners. I'm going to mat the watercolor panel with a piece of black cardstock, and then I'll pop that up on Sticky Back Fun Foam for all three of the cards. They will all be finished exactly the same, and I didn't add any embellishment. Let me show a side-by-side comparison as I share my thoughts. But before I share, tell me in the comments down below if one of these mediums suits you better than the other. I'd love to know if you don't have these mediums already, whether or not this video has helped you decide which one to invest in. As for me, if you follow my videos, then you know my most used medium is my artist watercolor pans. There's a sensory satisfaction to rehydrating the pans and mixing the pigments that I don't get with the brushes or the pencils. I also love the granulation that you get with the watercolor pans, and for me this looks more like traditional watercolor than the brushes or the pencils. For vibrancy, clarity, and purity of color, the brush markers win hands down. If you don't fancy the brushes and you want to use your own watercolor brush, then you might consider buying the refills versus the actual brush markers. The pencils are ideal for ease of use, portability when you're traveling, vibrancy, and I love them for splatter. The pencils would be my top choice for beginners. Depending on my mood or the technique that I'm trying, I may use a different medium, so I count myself very lucky to have all three of these mediums to explore. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you soon with more inspiration.
Hello crafters, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. Thanks for watching!